I am here today to talk about Edward Said and post-colonial studies and post-colonial criticism and the way they influence discussions of comparative culture. So you've all read the introduction to Edward Said's book Orientalism, which appeared in 1978. So, so it's worth remembering the moment in which this appeared, thinking that this book is over 30 years old now. And so when you think of the arguments that are being made, then you might want to take that into mind. Now, before I talk a little bit about the argument and the ramifications of the argument of the chapter from the book that you read, I want to start off by asking a question. And this is a question that the author himself poses near the end of the book. In fact, one of the last pages of the book it comes up. And the question he asks is, how do we represent another culture? Okay? Now, in this question, there are two embedded questions. The first one is, what does it mean to represent something, or represent an object, or represent a culture, or represent a people? Okay? This seems fairly straightforward to us, right? We describe it, we depict it, we represent things in paintings, we represent things in literature. There's a kind of representation of an event that goes on if you make a film about it. But in fact, Said's argument in Orientalism causes us to reflect on this process of representation. It's something that we do when we write an English paper. If you're writing an English paper about an African novel, it's something that you do when you do an anthropology project, if you try to describe the characteristics of certain cultures. And it's specifically this idea of representing culture that Said is focusing on in his argument, and that he raises very pointed questions to us about. Okay? The second question that's embedded in my general question that I asked is, what is another culture, right? So you see at the end of it, it says, how do we represent another culture? What does it mean to call a culture, a certain culture, other? And you know, this is central to the argument that he's making. So for example, in this book, he's speaking of the Orient. And he makes the point very early on that when we think of the Orient in the United States, we think of East Asia. But he's talking about a time and a place where the term is used differently. So he's thinking of the Orient in the British and French sense, the way it was used in England and France in the 18th century through the middle of the 20th century. And in this sense, he's talking basically about the Arabo-Islamic world. So anywhere, if your geography, if you have the map in your head, anywhere from Iran to Morocco, the North African countries, the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, the countries of what is sometimes called the Levant or the Eastern Mediterranean, the central countries of the Islamic world, to put it in other terms. Okay? Now, it might seem fairly self-evident to us that people who live in this region and people who write and speak the languages of the region and write in those languages and produce cultural artifacts in that region are from a culture that's other than our own. They're not focused on Lindsay Lohan and the things that we, Fox News and the things that we absorb or that we consume here. They're focused on their own set of cultural concerns and cultural interests. But in fact, it's not so simple to say that the North African countries, the countries of the Middle East, the Arabic-speaking countries, the Arabo-Islamic countries, the countries of the Muslim world, are a completely different culture from ourselves. There are, in fact, several things that tie us very closely to them. For example, the religion of Islam conceives of itself or thinks of itself as the completion of a kind of cycle of religions that begins with Judaism and extends through Christianity. So if you pick up a copy of the Quran, for example, the Holy Book of Islam, you'll see that it makes several references to the prophets that someone who comes from a Jewish or a Christian background would be very familiar with. And the stories of the Bible are often retold in slightly different form or in slightly abbreviated form in the Quran. Therefore, the holy book itself that is sort of foundational to the Arabic language and to much of the culture of the region is growing out of Judeo-Christian traditions. In the medieval period, in the Middle Ages, in the period from, say, the 8th century through to the 13th or 14th century, you have a great deal of influence of Arabic philosophy and thought coming from Islamic thinkers in Southern Europe and even in Northern Europe, even to the point where up until about the 15th century it was very common for students of philosophy or theology or many of the medicine, astronomy, many of the natural sciences in Europe to learn Arabic as a language of learning, because it was through the Arab world and through translations that were done in the Arab world during those centuries that Europeans came to know of classical learning in Greece and Rome and the places that we now consider to be foundational to what we think of as our own culture. So that's another area in which, that's the second area in which there is an intimate connection historically in the thought and culture of North Africa and the Middle East on the one hand, and Europe and the United States and what we sometimes call the West on the other hand. And finally, there's a third connection which is very important for this argument, and which I'll use as a transition to start getting into the argument that Edward Said makes in the chapter that you read. That third connection is that starting around the 18th century, in the 1700s, the late 1700s in the case of the region that we're concerned with here, Europe set out to colonize or have a colonial relationship, or a relationship of what the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci would call hegemony, which basically means, influence and a kind of rule based on culture and based on influence, to have a relationship of power in which it had hegemony over, or in which it ruled over the peoples of the region of North Africa and the Middle East. And this begins roughly, we can trace the starting point back to Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in the year 1798. So 1798, Napoleon invades Egypt. At that moment, there had already been something of a contest among the European powers, particularly between Great Britain and France, to begin acquiring properties and acquiring influence in the African and Asian regions. So you had, for example, the British East India Company was formed in the early 1600s, at the very beginning of the 17th century. And the Dutch also formed the East India Company around the same time. And France began pursuing colonial interests and trade and sovereignty in Indochina and in the Spice Islands and in the region of South Asia. Similarly, the Portuguese had trading interests and colonial interests in these regions. So there was this grand enterprise by which Europe began taking an interest in having a kind of ruling over other parts of the world that had not technologically modernized to the same extent that Europe had. And the motivation was not any kind of nefarious desire to destroy other cultures. The motivation was a kind of probably in many cases sincere sense of bringing advanced civilization to these parts of the world. But there was also very much an economic motive. And in fact, the economic motive the question of whether anybody who civilized who is something that scholars would debate very heatedly today. But the question of what the economic benefit of the colonial project was for Europe is really not in any kind of question by historians. That is to say that Europe benefited greatly. And to some extent, the reason why we live such comfortable lives, relatively speaking, in the countries of Western Europe and North America, the United States and Canada today, is because of this history of colonialism and the way it helped countries of the West enrich themselves. Oftentimes, it must be said, at the expense of the countries that they were dominating. Okay, so in 1798, Napoleon invades Egypt. The British immediately intervene, and they, within 3 years, then they've worked together with local governors to expel Napoleon from Egypt. But this causes Egyptians to be beholden to the British, right, because they've sort of saved them from French occupation. And Egypt being historically a very influential space in the region, this event ushers in a long period of the extension of European influence, especially French and British influence, throughout the regions of North Africa and the Middle East. So the French, again, they later will invade Algeria in the 1830s, and it won't be long before they'll spread their influence to the rest of Northwest Africa. The British get more and more, come to have more and more sovereignty over Egypt over the course of the 1800s, and then eventually the Ottoman Empire, which is in place at the time and which is based in Istanbul in Turkey, becomes weaker and weaker as British and French influence becomes stronger and stronger. And by the time of World War I, you basically have a total collapse of the Ottoman Empire and a total kind of carving up of the region by the British and French. So this is a historical background to the period that Edward Said is going to focus on in his study of Orientalism. Now, Orientalism is, for Said, a discipline in which travelers, scholars, experts in language, experts in culture, travel to the Middle East or in other ways take up the study of the Middle East and North Africa in England and France and create a kind of body of letters that they consider to be authoritative statements about the region in the kind of bibliography of what any learned person would study and read and look at in England and France during this period of the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and the early 1900s. Okay? So this is what he means when he talks about Orientalism. And what he is trying to convince us that we should be doing in his book is that we should think of Orientalism as a discourse. Okay? And he tells you in the introduction that you've read that he's taking this term discourse from a French philosopher who was becoming known in the United States in the 1970s, was already a household name in France, but was becoming known and influential in the United States in the 1970s, named Michel Foucault. Okay, now what does it mean to call Orientalism a discourse? One of the things that he's saying is that Orientalists, scholars, men of letters, and travelers who studied the Middle East in England and France during the period of the 18th through the 20th century tended to cite each other and refer to each other. And so they created a kind of body of knowledge that was self-referential and that was in some ways self-fulfilling. Okay? Now, immediately you're thinking, well, this means that, they're just sort of referring to each other and they're not going out and doing real scientific observation of the people and of the culture, and the result is that it's wrong. Well, there's a kind of a tricky point here, which is very important to emphasize. Edward Said is not trying to say that the Orientalist statements about North Africa and the Middle East in the 1800s were incorrect or untrue. In fact, it's important, although difficult, kind of a difficult, subtle point to get around, but it's important to sort of think about this. He's trying to say that it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, and that in some ways to talk about the truth of their statements doesn't make any sense in this context. Okay? So by talking about it as a discourse, a discourse from Michel Foucault was always a way of thinking and a way of talking, a way of speaking, which Orientalism certainly was. It's a way of thinking about a certain region and a certain people, a certain culture, if you will, and it's a way of speaking about it. But discourse always, for Michel Foucault, and similarly for Said in this study, always involves power. Okay, so it's always connected to certain political motivations. And what Said is suggesting to us in this particular study is that when we think of Orientalism, we should think about a kind of history of that relationship between power and speech, between power and writing, between power and scholarship. And that relationship should be our focus, not the relationship between, say, the speech of an Orientalist and the reality of the Orient. Okay? So that leads to a number of important consequences. First of all, people tend to read Orientalism, Said's study, a little bit too quickly sometimes and say, oh, he's talking about the way the West stereotyped Arabs and Muslims. Well, perhaps, but there's something more to it than that, which is very important. Stereotyping and misunderstanding happens always across different regions and across different cultures. And certainly, I don't know, you could go to some other part of the world that's poor and provincial and ask them what they think about our life here in Houston, and you would probably get a response that wouldn't be that knowing. It might be based on stereotypes on some, bad Arnold Schwarzenegger movies that they've seen or something like that. It wouldn't necessarily be that insightful. It would be more of a kind of a discourse, a stereotypical, not so much a discourse, but a stereotypical way of thinking of the United States. But this is more than a stereotype, right? When he calls it a discourse, because it's connected with a project of hegemony. It's connected with power, and it's to put it more bluntly, it's connected with European domination of the region. Okay? He tells you in the introduction that he's beginning roughly with the 18th century. Okay? So he's beginning roughly with the 1700s. And he tells you that although there was a great deal of scholarship about the region produced in Germany and produced in other parts of Europe, he's focusing on Britain and France. And he explains a little bit about why he's focusing on those two places. Okay, so let's think for a second about the 18th century as a starting point, and England and France as, Great Britain and France as the two places, okay? The 18th century is the century in which, a couple things we can say about that. So historically speaking, this is the moment in which the project of European colonization of this region, of the Arabo-Islamic region, begins in earnest. And right, we just talked about that. That happens with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. So it's the late 1700s when this begins in earnest. And it really gathers momentum over the course of the 1800s through the French colonization of Algeria and through the expansion of British influence in Egypt. So this is one reason why we're looking at the 18th century, and why the 18th century as a starting point is very important. And England and France similarly, right? England and France, but not Germany, for example, are important because those are the places where we can see most explicitly the relationship between a dynamic of power and a way of speaking, a kind of discourse that presents itself as disinterested. Right? Orientalism was supposed to be scholarship where you learned about the Arabic language, where you learned about Islamic holy texts and what their origins were and what their history was and how to interpret them, etc. So this is presenting itself as kind of disinterested scholarship, but we now, in Said's study, are looking at it from a vantage point where we should be able to see beyond that. And it's specifically the link between the politics and the process of representation that he's interested in exposing, and the place and the time that he sets out as the kind of parameters of his study reinforce that idea of a relationship between power and representations. Okay? Now, we can say one other thing about the 18th century. The 18th century has a specific kind of importance for the philosopher Michel Foucault, and again, it causes us to sort of reflect on our own position in this whole idea of thinking across cultures. For Michel Foucault, and you know, Said is following him in this. I think, you know, they both believe that we had been kind of fooled as Americans or Europeans about what the 1700s should mean to us today. I grew up in the United States. When I went to middle school and high school, I was taught that this was a time when basically our modern idea of human rights was born. We had a Declaration of Independence in the 18th century, in the late 1700s. The French Revolution, that was based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, happened then. The Magna Carta in Britain was signed much earlier, but perhaps its aspirations came to full fruition around this time, when there was a kind of movement in the air, when there was something in the air between Europe and North America around this idea of human rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. This was the kind of, you know, language that was used in the 1800s. And what Michel Foucault wants to suggest is that a discourse was created in the 1700s that convinced us that we had a kind of liberty that we never really had. So, you know, the people who wrote about all men being created equal, to take a very pointed example from our own history in the United States, you know, the people that wrote about all men being created equal were the owners of slaves. Right? And similarly in France, the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity was being promulgated at the same time France was expanding its empires overseas and putting Africans and Asians and Arabs under a kind of colonial regime that, you know, didn't suggest much at all about equality and fraternity. So there were always these contradictions, right? There was a slave trade going on that the French and the British and the Portuguese and the Americans were participating in the 1700s, and nobody felt like these ideas about human rights should call that into question. So there's always been throughout our history a kind of way in which we say things about our freedoms and our equalities as a way of camouflaging or masking the restrictions that 18th century society in the West places upon us through various institutions. So in Michel Foucault's case, he'll talk about the fact that you know, our contemporary idea of what madness is evolves at this time. And right, if you go back and look and the Renaissance period, there's a kind of idea of the mad, if you think of the fool in Shakespeare's King Lear, right? Or think of the philosopher Erasmus's essay in praise of folly, right? In praise of madness. There's a kind of sense that people who think differently or who might be looked at as mad by the rest of society have a kind of insight that the rest of us don't have. And that after the 1700s into the 1800s, that notion no longer existed. Suddenly it became important to put these people away in institutions, to separate them from the rest of society. They needed to be, they were pathologized, if you will, and needed to be treated therapeutically. So Foucault goes through historical examples similar to this over the course of his work in the way we think about sexuality, in the way we think about crime and punishment, in the way we think about the practice of medicine, and there are other examples that one finds in his work as well. The way we think about literature and literature as an institution and literature as part of our educational system. So for Edward Said, he's interested in thinking about Orientalism as a practice and Orientalism as a discipline in this same way. Right? It presents itself as something that gives us knowledge of another culture, lets us know about another place, opens a whole new world for us. At the same time, if we look into it and we look at it as a kind of history of a way of thinking, we start to see that it's incredibly repetitive and that Orientalists borrowed from one another through the generations. Borrowed ideas and borrowed notions and borrowed kind of generalizations about the culture that they were writing about. And surprise, surprise, they always came down to the conclusion that the society and culture that they were studying when they went to North Africa and the Middle East was lesser than the society and the culture that they lived in. And oftentimes it took a very long time to get to that point, right? There was a great deal of very sophisticated and very learned study and discussion that came before you arrived at that conclusion. But always that conclusion is there at the end of the work of the Orientalists, either directly or indirectly. And what Said wants to call our attention to is the fact that that conclusion fit very neatly with the project of colonizing, dominating, and taking over the region that was going on simultaneously in the realm of politics in England and France at the same time. Okay? Now, a couple last things about Said's Orientalism, and then let's think a little bit about the influence that it had and the ramifications of it for thinking about cultures and thinking about the study of culture. One thing that's important to note, people often make this mistake when they see the name of the author and learn about his background. He's a Palestinian who worked and lived in the United States for most of his adult life, for all of his adult life, but who grew up in between Jerusalem and Cairo, so he grew up in the region that he's writing about. His name, obviously his last name you can see is an Arab name, and he's writing about, he seems to be writing about this region that he grew up in. It's important to note that that's not really what he's doing, right? He's writing a book about, for lack of a better phrase, Western culture. He's writing a book about Europe and about the United States. He's writing about the way we think, not about the way people living in the Arabo-Islamic region think. And he makes that clear. If you read the introduction carefully, there's a point where he says there's a kind of brute reality over there that's far more complex than anything any Orientalist or other writer can say about it. And about that fact, I have nothing to say really in this study other than to acknowledge it tacitly, right? So he silently acknowledges the fact that there are these complexities out there, but my study is not going to address that. So you need to understand and you need to be very clear that when you read Said's Orientalism, you're reading a book about the way Westerners, the way Europeans, the way North Americans look at other parts of the world that they consider to be different from them or that they consider to be other cultures. Okay? And maybe, you know, a great deal of what he's suggesting is that maybe one of the very first steps in imagining dominating another people is thinking about them as another people, right? When one could easily, especially in the case of North Africans, Arabs and Muslims, one could almost as easily imagine them as part of our culture, right? So, simple example is, instead of thinking of the culture that we live in as Judeo-Christian culture, which is a phrase that's often used, what if we thought of it as Judeo-Christian Islamic culture? Right? Suddenly you are emphasizing the continuities between these different ways of thinking and looking at the world, the diverse ways of thinking and looking at the world, rather than emphasizing the difference and the contestation that's been there throughout history. So this is the kind of thing that should give us pause and should make us think about the way power and our kind of like lust for power globally might be influencing what we think about when we think of, try to think of other cultures somewhat scientifically or somewhat empirically. Okay? Now, Edward Said's text was very influential. It created a whole discipline that we refer to as postcolonial studies. Postcolonial studies began to sort of formulate itself as a discipline within American universities in the 1980s, and it really gathered more momentum in the 1990s and in the 2000s. And the idea of postcolonial studies was to think about colonialism, the colonialism that was so influential in shaping the nature of the discourse of Orientalism, and think about it and think about the way it had influenced all of our cultures, and the way it had shaped the way all of us think about culture, and think about travel, and think about the world, and think about difference and similarity within the world. Okay? So there was a part of postcolonial studies which was analyzing colonial discourse. Okay? Analyzing colonial discourse. So in Said's Orientalism, we can look at his book, the full 300-page book. If you read the whole thing, you're getting one of the first American academic studies of colonial discourse. And out of that grows a whole slew of studies in something that we now call colonial discourse analysis. And colonial discourse analysis is looking at the way colonizers talked about, wrote about, and viewed those that they colonized. Okay, this is basically what colonial discourse analysis is. So it's looking at the way colonialism, in a kind of reflected sort of way, shapes and influences the culture of the colonizer, the culture of the countries that influence or have hegemonic sovereignty over other parts of the world. Okay? There's another part of postcolonial studies, and this is a part that doesn't really come up in this study, in Said's study, but it's also the way colonialism shaped and influenced the people that were colonized, right? And that's something that was left out of Said's initial work. Later in his life, he begins to address it more, but it doesn't, as we've said before, it doesn't come up at all in this book. This brings us to the criticisms of the argument that Edward Said makes in Orientalism, and one of them is that, that very thing. How is it possible to talk simply about how is it possible to talk about the colonial project and colonial discourse without ever mentioning those peoples and those communities that the colonial project was acted upon. Right? And so people took Edward Said to task for setting out those parameters incorrectly at the beginning of his study and saying, I'm only going to talk about the West and the Westerners' gaze. Right? People came back and they said, well, no, wait a second. Colonialism had two interlocutors involved. It had those who colonized, but also those who were colonized. And that in order to fully understand the phenomenon and fully understand its discourses and its histories, we need to study both sides of that, both lenses, if you will. Okay? Another thing that people came along and said, and then Said later in his life, as I say, makes some concession on that and says, yes, I tried to make a contribution with Orientalism, but certainly we can't talk about colonialism without talking about resistance to colonialism and the kind of culture of decolonization at the same time. And that causes us to, study what people wrote in Arabic about the phenomenon of colonialism and about the presence of the British and French in the region, or what they wrote in Javanese in Indonesia about the Dutch, or what they wrote in the Indian vernacular languages about the British presence in India. Okay? Another important criticism that was made of Edward Said's book, and that had a great deal of resonance with work on colonial discourse that came later. People said, well, wait a second, aren't you being way too general, right? I mean, there's always been a kind of diversity of opinion in any part of the world when you're discussing other so-called other cultures, right? So certainly in Europe in the 18th and 19th and 20th century, there were anti-imperialist leagues, and there were people who criticized imperialism, and there were people who looked at the Orient, at the so-called Orient, differently from the scholars and experts that Said focuses on in his work. And it must be said that Said, in contrast to the first criticism, this was something that Said made very little concession on. And in fact, the older he got and the more research he did, the more he became convinced that what we needed to do was stand in awe of the amazing consensus amongst all types of intellectuals with all types of ideologies in England and France during the 1800s around the idea that colonialism was a good thing, and that the colonizers were essentially a lower order of human being than people in England and France were. And he, just felt like, well, it's incumbent upon us to come out and say that honestly. And many of his students and many people who were greatly influenced by his book disagreed with him on that point. They did find resistance and criticism of the status quo in those different societies. But he, the more he looked into it, the more he thought, well, no, this is just hair splitting. And that the brute reality is that power created an amazing consensus around this idea of superiority that became essential to British and French and American culture and the way it looked at the rest of the world. And of course, eventually he wants to argue, and this is like a huge topic for discussion that no doubt you'll get into when you turn this video off. He wants to argue that these ways of thinking and these types of discourse still greatly influence the way we think today about places like Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world, and the way we thought about Vietnam, for example, in the 70s, and other parts of the world where the U.S. And to a lesser extent today Europe, but still the U.S. certainly, and to some extent Western Europe, have influence and sovereignty in these different areas of the world that were once colonized, colonies of England and France, Portugal, Holland, Belgium, and the other European powers. Okay, so that's with respect to some of the objections to Edward Said's argument. Continuing along those lines, we might say that let's think for a second about culture or discourse in parts of the world where in parts of the world that were colonized. Right? So, if we think of the Arabo-Islamic region, for example, or other parts of Asia and Africa, there's another argument that could be made against, not so much against Said and Orientalism, but against this discipline of postcolonial studies that grew out of his work. Many critics came along and they said, look, these are more recent arguments actually, but many critics came along and they said, look, the problem with looking at Africa or looking at the Middle East and saying, calling these societies post-colonial societies, there's some good things about that because it shows that there was a great influence to the moment when Europe came in and invaded and occupied, and that was very determinative and made them more or less the way they are today. No doubt about that. But it didn't completely make them the way they are today, right? These societies had realities, lived realities that were present before Europe came along, and that in some ways, those earlier lived realities, those pre-colonial lived realities, still have some resonance in modern life. And that gets completely erased when you talk about them as post-colonial societies or post-colonial cultures. So there's that argument and objection as well, and it's in some ways the converse of the argument that says Edward Said generalized too much about the West, right? It says that post-colonial studies that grew out of Edward Said is too general in the way it talks about the former colonies and their own cultures. Okay, and it's with that in mind that that I invited you to read and think about the story, A Tale Told by a Dog, written by the Egyptian writer Yahya Tahir Abdullah. So let me conclude by just saying a few things about Yahya Tahir Abdullah and the story that you've all read by him for today, and then how one might go about thinking about it together with Edward Said's book chapter, which, of course, obviously you can see is a very different type of thing. So first of all, a few facts about Yahya Tahir Abdullah. He was, as I said, he was Egyptian, but it's important to know that he was from southern Egypt. And southern Egypt is, up until today, a more rural area than northern Egypt, right? The big cities in Egypt are Alexandria and Cairo. They're both in the north. They're both around the delta, in the case of Cairo, the Mediterranean Sea in the case of Alexandria. And whereas Alexandria and Cairo are very big cities, they have millions of inhabitants, they're very connected to the rest of the world, right? When you saw in spring of 2011, the Egyptian Revolution was featured so prominently on American news and on American television. You could see the way that media from all over the world could easily descend upon Egypt because it's so kind of international. The center, the metropolitan centers in Egypt, Cairo and Alexandria are at least. But the south of Egypt is different. The south of Egypt is poorer. It's less urban. It doesn't have the big cities that the north of Egypt has. The people that live there are sometimes considered by the northerners to be less sophisticated, less civilized, right? If they in the particularly stereotypical thinking, and there's even a kind of racial discrimination, even though they're the same race. The greater level of poverty and unequal development in the south of Egypt leads people to think of them as a different race, as a kind of lower race, when they're looking at them from the north, even though they're actually the same people. So Yahya Tahir Abdullah is an interesting writer because he comes from that kind of background, what a post-colonial studies critic might call a subaltern background. And he moves to Cairo and he becomes a kind of celebrated writer in his youth because he's writing about experiences that are not familiar to the people in Cairo. And he's writing in ways, and he's using forms that are not the forms of the Cairo literary figures. And so he's this very unique figure who's celebrated early in his life, and then he dies very young in a car accident. So one could kind of look at this story that he's written, A Tale Told by a Dog. It's one of his longer stories. He wrote a lot of microfictions, very short stories. So this story, even though it's not long, is one of his longer stories. And it's kind of an autobiography, right? If you think about it, at first you think it's kind of like a silly story about animals that can talk. But the more you read it, the more you see there are these direct references to things like working class neighborhoods and to the kind of divide between the country and the city. And, you know, the bourgeois dogs that he aspires to be accepted by, they all speak many different languages. And, the poodle that he falls in love with says to him, uses French at one point in the short story. And so there are these references to the way outside influence exerts power in the region, but it's mostly about, the story seems to be mostly about, if we can interpret it as a kind of allegory, about inequalities within Egyptian society, inequalities between different regions, between different, ethnic groups, and between different socioeconomic classes. Okay, that's, I think, something that one can see. Now, so it's worth noting, the first thing that we can say if we want to put it together with Orientalism is that we can say there is the outside influence of colonialism is still resonant in some ways in the way those super rich characters from the city are portrayed as, the inheritors of all sorts of luxury and privilege. At the same time, the story's emphasis is on the way inequality exists within Egyptian society, completely separate from outside influence. And so this gives us some sense of how complicated, historically, relationships might be in a society that we don't learn that much about if we just look at things from the point of view of colonial discourse. Okay? The other thing that one wants to say is whenever we talk about literature, we have to talk about the form of literature. That is, we have to talk about the way literature is presented as opposed to, say, an argument or an exposition that you might read by an academic or a historian where you're just being presented the argument and you can look at the argument and kind of examine it. This is a different kind of writing, obviously, right? So we have to think about how is the story being told. Again, I think the way the story is told takes us back to the question of the post-colonial, right? Because Yahya Tahir Abdullah is somebody who comes from southern Egypt and comes out of a tradition that's very old-fashioned, in some ways very traditional, was interested in using techniques that an anthropologist might call folkloric in his storytelling, using them to describe very modern problems like urbanization and like socioeconomic class divisions, right? So you have talking animals. You have a series of very short stories, right? And the talking animals, if you think of Aesop's fables, right, that's something you might remember from when you were a kid. But those of you who know anything about the Middle East or about Asian culture know that there's a very much longer tradition of stories, usually that have some kind of moral payoff at the end of them. In the ancient tradition, in the classical literature of South Asia, of West Asia, and of North Africa. So think of talking animals in the Panchatantra, which is an Indian cycle of stories. And there's a cycle of stories featuring talking animals based on the Panchatantra called Kalila and Dimna that's very influential in Iran and in the Arab world. And Kalila and Dimna influenced the Arabian Nights, which is the one that would be most familiar to all of you. And if you read through the Arabian Nights, then sure enough you'll find that there are some stories where animals talk and animals act as though they're human. So Yahya Tahir Abdullah is reaching back to these moments that are that predate colonialism, to call into question very modern, very dynamic, contemporary historical phenomenon: inequality in society, the problems of urbanization, the problems of migration, right? The main character, the main dog in the story, immigrates at one point and talks about his reasons for immigrating and his need to immigrate, right? And he finds inequality on both sides of the equation, before he immigrates and after he immigrates. And he finds that his kind of consciousness has been shaped by by his roots and by the context he came out of, and that's something that he has a very difficult time escaping by the time you get to the end of the story. So the way the story is told emphasizes the complexity of the society. It emphasizes, I think, again, suggests that that the phrase post-colonial does have its limits in trying to describe, for example, the literature of Egypt after it becomes independent from British colonial influence in 1952 and 1956. All this is to say that the insights that come out of post-colonial studies and the post-colonial lens in studying culture are very important. They raise important questions for us. They make us think about what sort of practice we're involved in when we try to generalize about other places that we don't know or that we don't live ourselves. Even though that's true, the post-colonial paradigm itself also can be limiting, and that it's important to constantly be critiquing our own position as we think across cultures, but also be prepared to think about what the limits of the kind of critique that grows out of Edward Said's work might be as well in expressing and understanding the complexity of other parts of the world that we would like to be more aware of, more sensitive toward, and less antagonistic toward through our intellectual enterprises. And thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very good discussion of this tape and of the reading that you've done.